Thank you, Ron. I wanted to raise with the panel generally, but I'll begin, Father Kelly, if I could, with you. The comment which Dr. Ranson made yesterday, which some of you may have heard if you heard his evidence or read the transcript. He was speaking about the extraordinary power that priests have in being acquainted with God in people's eyes, particularly in the eyes of children, and the need for priests to be aware of this in the way they perceive themselves. And he posed this question, which in a sense is a question for this panel. Now, the point here is, how are priests in their formation, how aware are priests in their formation of this extraordinary dynamic? How is this dynamic introduced to trainee clergy? How are they taught to take responsibility for this dynamic? How are they taught how to continuously reflect on this dynamic in the exercise of their ministry? Can I just ask, firstly, you, Father Kelly, your reflections on that notion?
When they're part of the parish and they're near the primary school, etc., we discuss with them that relationship and how special it is with those children, and when they go out and teach catechetics in the state schools, they go with supervisors and that, and so we talk about that you're really there to help them to discover the love of God. That's basically how we put it to them. And you, as an adult, you must be aware of all the boundaries that surround treating that little person with utmost respect and dignity.
Can I ask, firstly, Father Thompson, whether there are aspects of formation that you see as important to try and address that kind of power that power dynamic that can develop?
I'm not quite sure if I understood your original question. You mentioned something about children seeing the priest as God.
Yes, and Dr. Ranson's point was that is a powerful dynamic and a dangerous dynamic that priests need to be aware of and need to manage.
Yes, I don't think that's all that common from my experience, but it's something that our future priests need to be warned of all kinds of situations, of dangers and pitfalls, and they need to be aware that may be the case, and they may even unconsciously play on it. So I guess half the problem of solving these problems is to be aware of them.
But are there any particular aspects of the formation in your college that do make priests aware of that?
We do a thorough course on catechetics. The students are out regularly, some of them once a week. They're supervised both by someone from the seminary, more often by one of the resident teachers in the schools. We get reports from that. I think if there was any signs that was the attitude they were taking, we'd hear about it. Of course, they're not going as priests, they're going as students. I don't think certainly the danger is not there. The children in the school just see them as special visiting lecturers. They may understand that they're trainee priests. But I've never heard of that. No one has ever reported back to me that that's the way they're being treated.
Father Hogan, what about in your seminary? Are there any particular features of the formation that you would see as helping priests in their formation to understand that dynamic and the dangers of that dynamic?
Yeah, we have a very substantial psychology input during year one, and a substantial part of that is developmental psychology, and I teach them the dynamics of childhood. And one of the aspects of childhood is that children think very concretely. They can't deal with wonderful aspects of Jesus up in heaven and stuff like that. They see the priest at the altar dressed differently, and they think you're Jesus. Often parents will come up to me with the child afterwards and say, she thinks you're Jesus. They think it's cute. But that kind of ideation only lasts for a little while because the child is continually developing, and at some point later will move into semi-abstract and abstract thinking. So my seminarians certainly would be aware of the phenomenon of how children think.
Sister Ellen?
Yes, we also have a number of formation programs in place, teaching professional and personal boundaries, beginning in the very first year, and then the working together with the Catholic education system, and they go out to Leichhardt, for example, for 3 days with the CEO and work on integrity in service of the church. They are taught the integrity of ministry, and then we also have pastoral theology, et cetera, all throughout their whole seminary training. And in terms of myself, I work with them on understanding their own psychological dynamics. And so if we, in my classes in the first, second, and third year, we look at narcissism, we look at transference and countertransference issues, so that if someone is striving to develop a power relationship or with a child or with anyone whom they are serving, then that is dealt with very clearly. And so we have in terms of our formation team, but I think as well as what they're taught in these different classes. And it's also an issue of assisting the seminarians to reflect on their own experience, because they will be in numerous situations throughout their training, as well as naturally after they have been ordained, when they will be in situations where they could take power. So they have to learn the difference between power and authority, and humility, and learning how to serve rather than to seek something on their self-satisfaction. So we focus very much on those issues.
Are students in your seminary still taught that they are ontologically changed when they take ordination?
Yes.
Do you see that as a potentially dangerous notion in their self-image?
It could be if they have not developed a strong sense of belonging to the people of God. And so, yes, they are ontologically changed, or there are various ways of stating that, but it also has to do with how do they understand themselves, and does their ego, does their own identity need that to be of service to the church?
What are the I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I just wanted to clarify that, because if they are in need of that ontological change, of seeing that ontological change as finding an additional identity, a priestly identity, then that's a problem. Yes, it's true that they are ontologically changed, but that does not make them, put them on a other level or a higher level than those people whom they are serving.
What does it do in your understanding?
It means that they are more closely formed to Christ, that they have taken on an identity as an altar Christ, for example, when they would serve Mass.
That in the space we're talking about clericalism, that creates an immediate capacity for serious distortion, doesn't it?
Again, no, it does not. In itself, it does not per se.
No, but the risk is there.
Well, the risk is there with a number of things.
But in this space, in that context, it's a very real risk, isn't it?
I believe, I would tend to disagree in the sense that I would say that's why we have to form our seminarians in knowing the abuses of power and of knowing how to utilize their person as an altar Christ in their work. In other words, it's true that someone could abuse that, but it's true that someone could abuse that who has not been ordained, who is not.
Suggested to us, I think, yesterday that true ontological change occurs when anyone is baptised.
That's right. That is correct.
The add-on that's has it occurring when the priest is ordained is not a correct reflection of the gospel.
Well, I would not necessarily agree with that, but I absolutely do agree that the first and the major ontological change of all Christians is baptism. I agree.
Do you accept that there is a serious issue that the Church must address with respect to clericalism?
Yes.
And how do you say that issue presently manifests itself in the Church?
I think the way it manifests itself is within priests or seminarians who do not have a clear sense of their own identity as being members in the body of Christ and in terms of their ministry, of serving the body of Christ. In other words, they're not there to, I think as Bishop Randazzo said yesterday, the pedestal is the cross. And they have to be willing to serve and not seek to be served. So clericalism, again, I'm saying, yes, it can be expressed in external manners, but the problem with clericalism exists in the heart and in the mind. And that's what my work is to address. And that's what I address in the seminary.
You see, I've presently understood it as, yes, coming from the identity given to the priest, but it's a phenomenon that operates in the minds of the laity, which has created this capacity or space within which offending priests can operate. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand. But I would say that ontological change does not mean perfection. It does not mean that any individual is perfect. It does not mean that they make no mistakes. And I'm very grateful that the laity is becoming more and more aware of the need to develop healthy relationships with priests, with others who are serving in the church, sisters, whomever, but that we are all human beings. We are all people who have our weaknesses and our strengths.
Do you understand that for a devout Catholic family, the concept of ontological change in the priest is likely, in some people at least, to set up a special way of looking and a degree of, obviously, sometimes misplaced trust?
Yes, I agree with you, and that is unfortunate.
Well,
and that's what we need to work on.
What should be done about it?
I do my work in the seminary to try to work against that. And we all do in our seminary. We all work against that. And we also have communications with lay people, for example, the people who are supervising seminarians in the schools or in the hospitals. They go in and work with the ill in the hospitals, with homes for the elderly. They do all of that. And lay people there are very strong and very clear in saying, we see this weakness, we see this tendency, we see this, and then we work on it with the seminaries. We're very grateful for that.
You see, as you know, the extent to which there's sexual abuse of children generally in society is, in the family context,
Yes.
far more prevalent than in the church context.
Yes, and I've worked with many.
I'm sure you have. But the fundamental elements are the same, aren't they? There's a relationship which includes an acceptance of trust. Stepfather, father, grandfather, which are the three classic problems, and access. And when you set up a relationship that, by definition, creates trust in the priest and the access that comes as a consequence of that trust, you've got the same fundamental dynamics operating, haven't you?
You may, yes. Yes, and it may be abused.
Yes, and it's important, is it not, for the church to understand that and set its mind to break down the capacity for misplaced trust?
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean with capacity.
Well, for mum to say, because it's a priest who's taken my boy for the weekend, I don't have anything to worry about.
I would hope that that is not happening anymore.
Well, one would hope so too. But
And we need to educate more and more and more in families in around the world. We need to educate that that is no longer acceptable.
and the priest who puts the children to bed and the parishioners home.
That is not acceptable anymore, unless the parent is there with them.
These sorts of things being taught in your...
Oh yes, oh yeah, very clearly. And I role play with the seminarians, not that particular scene, but I role play with the seminarians on somebody's coming closer, somebody's boundaries, they're not being respected in their own boundaries. Or we have, as I mentioned before, transference and counter-transference issues, so that if a child or if an adolescent, for example, would have a great deal of trust in the priest, and the priest himself may be sexually aroused by that child or adolescent, then he would need, it's his responsibility, his transference or counter-transference related with that in relation to that child or adolescent has to be dealt with. So that's what we're working at with the seminary, to help them to understand their own dynamics, their own attractions, their own willingness, or their I won't use the word innocence, but their own naivete in terms of others' trust of them.
Does anyone else want to comment on these matters?
Yes, I would agree with Sister. We can't overnight change the attitude of the people. We can work on it. But the seminarians have to be made aware that that exists. And they've got to be made aware that it's a danger. That very often, unconsciously, subconsciously, they find themselves put on a pedestal by the people, and subconsciously they start misusing that power that they see they've got. That's, as I said, half the problem, half the way of solving a problem is to be aware of it. And those kind of things certainly figure largely in our human formation, our training of the seminarians now.
Anyone else?
I think the real test of whether the church is on board with change is whether or not it's prepared to jettison theological positions or theoretical positions that not only don't help but may harm, is the first point I would make. And I would put the notion of an ontological change in that category. I, for the life of me, can't see that it's a necessary element of understanding priesthood post-Vatican II. The second strategy I think that's really important is that that from day one, from cradle to grave, there need to be very clear strategies in place that engage the notion, as Charles Taylor would put it, the Canadian philosopher, that human beings are constituted in conversation. And within that conversation, there needs to be a high level of what he also calls radical reflexivity, a capacity to examine one's own experience and scrutinise my own thinking and experience. And in order to do that, there have to be concrete strategies in place. So, for example, when I was working as a counsellor, for the last 25, 30 years, I've had a supervisor. I'd see that supervisor either fortnightly or monthly, just depending on what was going on. It wasn't conditioned on me being a student or in the preliminary phase of my practice. And in fact, in November when I moved back to Sydney, I did three things straight up. I got a doctor, I got a dentist, and I got a supervisor within the first couple of weeks. One of your witnesses, I think it was Jerry O'Hanlon, said at the end of his evidence, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The strategies need to be robust and they need to be within a context that allows those strategies to work and become embedded in a new way of seeing the world. I don't think that while we hold on to ways of thinking that don't help and may in fact do harm, that we're helping that process of change.
Yeah, I don't know an awful lot about the ontological change that takes place. I don't quite understand it philosophically. However, what I teach my seminarians is about being configured to Christ, which is a more modern way of looking at things. Baptism, yes, is a configuring to Christ as priest, prophet and king. That's who Christ is and how the Christian then is involved in the life of Christ himself. When it comes to ordination, the configuring as a deacon is to work of service, ministry. And as priest, it's configuring to Christ as head. Now, head isn't somebody who waltzes around strutting his stuff, expecting everybody to come and adore him. Christ's headship is based on being servant and shepherd. And they are roles of self-emptying for the sake of Christ's people. And I think that makes the most sense also to give the young lads practical applications and a practical understanding of what priesthood is about. It's about self-emptying for the sake of others. It's not about being the centre of attention, which is why we have the human formation that we do in our seminary. People have to be built up to have such a good understanding and acceptance of themselves that they are strong enough to give themselves away freely for the sake of others, that they're not holding anything back. And that's the level of generosity that in our seminary we try to build the seminarians up to.
Can I, just following on from that, is there not a dilemma that the conversation and understanding between the lay faithful and clergy is in fact not well articulated at all at the moment? That is, there are conversations taking place within the laity, there are conversations taking place within the religious and clergy. But what seems to be missing is a cross-conversation that fully articulates the relationship that we seek between the faithful and the clergy and religious, one that is mutually understood and agreed. So at the moment, are we not in danger of having these conversations, but they don't connect? So in a very practical sense, let me give an example. What congregation in Australia would know what are the boundaries, the code of ethics, codes of conduct, that would apply to clergy as it relates to children or to themselves? Well, the answer is, I think, none. The question also, going back to a point that His Honour raised, is what is the relationship that you believe is appropriate between a child and a priest in the eyes of a child? What is it that the child, a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old, is meant to think of a priest today? The danger we have is that much of the conversation in church today is one of fear. I can't touch the child. I can't go into the playground. A philosophy of fear about children seems to me to be ultimately a very destructive approach. Yet the converse is, what is the positive relationship that you believe the child should have with the priest in the eyes of the child and their family, and is that an articulated vision? So the question is, do we actually know, have we an articulated vision of this relationship between child and family and priest as it exists today? Or are we going down the slippery slope of a relationship based on fear, a fear either imposed by outside sources or a fear of lack of understanding of what this relationship should be? And I'm open to anyone who have a view about that. But I do think that in this last week or so, there is in fact dialogue happening, but it is not connected. And maybe I'm completely wrong about that. And I was wondering if anyone might comment on that.
I think there is, especially among some of the older priests, that they cannot understand what they can do, and they're frightened of being accused of molesting children, and they therefore withdraw. I'm aware of one priest who refuses to go into his school for that reason. That's unfortunate. But I think generally, especially with the young priests, they are able to see the children in the context of the family. They visit the families and they are able to relate to the children in the presence of the parents. And the children can see something of what the normal relations that the parents have to father, and they can see him as a friend rather than as a special kind of power figure. It will take some time, but that's the road I think we have to follow.
I caution even on that front. In private sessions, we have been told of children who stood next to the priest whilst he sat at a kitchen table with the mother on the far side and put his hand up the girl's skirt. And she was so frightened of the God-priest relationship, she did nothing, said nothing, and told no one until she told us. And that is not a singular instance. Those accounts of being abused in the home where the parents were has been said quite commonly. So I think one of the issues we might discuss here is whether it's right or fair for the entire onus to be on the priests or on the church. Namely, parents and children need to be educated as to risk and to danger and to the proper protection of the dignity of their persons. So a child that was well informed and had a trusting relationship with a mother, and a mother that was alert to risks, might have avoided the context we're in. It seems to me for the entire obligation to be on the church is a dangerous route to go. How do you react to that?
My understanding is that in our schools, not in all schools, children are educated about the dangers of being abused, about the dangers of adults taking liberties. And it's not just priests, it's all kinds of situations where they can perceive that adults are crossing boundaries. I think that that would go part of the way to the goal that you're suggesting. The adults on their part are probably slower to learn than the children.
If I could just ask a question related to the content involved in formation. Is there any consistent content amongst any of the seminaries about either child development, child psychology, understanding how to work with children and child safety? Or is it very inconsistent across the different institutions?
There is no prescribed syllabus as far as I know, but we are in touch with each other. We know what other seminaries are doing. If we think it's good, we try and...
Should there be a consistent syllabus around children and child development and protection of children across all seminaries?
I think I'd support that idea, yes.
I'd also support that. I think it's one thing to offer programs within a particular context, but since this is pervasive abuse, then I think it's incumbent upon, say, a diocese to provide and ensure that people are talking on the same page, off the same page. So I'd be encouraging that to take place, and I've found it very helpful in the Parramatta diocese to be able to send the novices to the various professional standards workshops that are offered, and now just recently the diocese has put together 8 modules, and this very day 4 of my novices are doing 7 hours of it. But what I'm saying is, I think it's getting to your point, is that there's a uniformity then, there's a common understanding. So I'm not doing this bit over here and that bit there, but we're doing it collectively, because it is a collective issue. That's...
May I tell you what goes on in our seminary? I've already mentioned the developmental psychology unit that we do, and also a large part of that is to do with childhood psychology. We also have the lads for the first 2 years doing scripture teaching in public schools, and before they start that, they have, I think, 6 or 8 Fridays of training that's not only about boundaries and things, but about how you deal with children, what to understand about them, how to read them. We have a 2-day workshop at the beginning of every year from professional standards and safeguarding, and the Safeguarding Office provides that and also comes out for follow-up days each year, so that by the end of seminary they would be very, very, very well associated with how to deal with children, not just at a professional level, but at the psychology level too.
Sister?
We also have every year in services, or the seminarians go out for professional standards, and so that even those who have been participating in that throughout the years, and then they, as well as new ones coming in who might come in through the 4th or 5th year, participated in another 4 modules of professional standards with the National Professional Standards Office. And so we have that. And then we've had during the 2nd year, I teach psychosexual development. And during that year, in the past couple of years, we'd have members of a religious community, men's religious community, come in. And so they've come in and they've participated in that class weekly, and have learned how to take a look at these developmental aspects, as well as psychosexual disorders. And and we're very happy to have others come in and participate with us. It's been very enriching.
How would you go about then developing a shared understanding or a consistent curriculum? What would be required in order to do that?
I think those who are teaching these classes, that's in addition to the professional standards, which is already organized and clear. It would be good if we would all get together and discuss it. We've not done that yet.
One of the issues that came up in evidence earlier in the week was also about the role of children in the confessional, and that if a child discloses sexual abuse to a priest within the confession, that's not a confession, and that can be reported to them. Is that a shared understanding in formation, or not? Anyone's free to comment?
As far as I understand, whatever's said in the context of the confessional is supposed to be secret.
Yes.
However, what one could advise...
Did anyone hear this evidence the other day?
Yes.
I'm not aware of it.
You're not aware of it?
Sorry.
But what can encourage...
What's said is that if a child comes in and confesses to its own misbehaviour, then that's subject to the seal. If the child comes in and says, my father, mother, grandfather or the priest interfered with me sexually, then because that's not misbehaviour by the child, it's not protected by the seal of the confessional. That's a pretty clear line of demarcation.
Yeah.
Is there any problem in any of you?
I would encourage the child to go and report.
What about you yourself? Why wouldn't you go and report?
I would be happy to go with the child.
But if the child was...
Sorry, I possibly misunderstood you because my hearing's not that good. Is there an actual confessional thing where the child's actually going to confession, just doesn't pop in and say, hey?
Now, gone to confession and said, look, I had impure thoughts about something that children might talk about, but also happened to say, and there was misbehaviour, which the child may well interpret as misbehaviour by the child, which is not uncommon. The child...
That's right.
Yes. But the evidence was there's a very clear line, and it's only when the child is confessing to misbehaviour by the child the seal applies. And what's your response to that?
My
Dr.
response,
Milroy would like to know.
I'd certainly have to go to a canon lawyer or a moral theologian.
So,
there certainly was a consistent approach to it the other day amongst all of the witnesses in saying that that would not be covered by the seal. So I'm just wondering whether this is something that is now taught in formation or whether this is a new revelation.
Well, if you excuse me, if once I get it clear for myself, I'm quite happy to do that.
Sister, did you hear the evidence?
I was going to say yes, I did. I'll give a parallel example of myself. Like I have a duty of confidentiality, and I had a 5-year-old child come to me who was. Whenever her parents were separated, she was 4, and whenever her father would come to pick her up, I could hear her screaming down the street as he was picking her up and taking her to his home. And this happened a couple of times, and I thought there's something untoward happening here. And so I talked with her, and she was able to say that her father was sexually abusing her. And so normally I would have the confidentiality, but what I did was I asked her, would it be all right with you if we share this with someone who will be able to help you? And she said she thought about it, and then she said yes. So I knew a woman in the police force who was able to help out. And so it ended up in a long involved case in court where her father refused to accept the fact that it had happened. Eventually they had her testimony. The child had to give testimony. in the presence of her mother, and so it was clarified, so she was able to stay with her mother. But for myself, I mean, I'm not a priest, and so I'm not in that situation. But I would always try, and I always have tried to say, can we work with this together and find a way for you to get out of this situation?
If you weren't a sister and a young girl was in the same situation and disclosed to you, what would you do?
The same.
And if the girl said, no, I don't want you to tell the police or whoever, what would you do?
Then I would ask her why.
And she says, oh, I just don't want you to tell.
Well, normally I would have a discussion with her as to why, and I would see how it would develop. Now, if she were being sexually abused, that's obviously clear for me that I would have to report it. Yeah, if she is being abused now, if it were in the past, it would be different.
So let's put you then in the position as a sister, and the same thing happens, and the girl says, no, I'm so scared of my father, I don't want you to tell the authorities. What would you do?
Then what I have done in the past in a situation like that is to contact someone in a protection office, child protection, or the police force, and just say, I would like to ask hypothetically about a question. And I might have a case, or if I had a case where this is the case, would you have any suggestions for me? And in the past, I've always been fortunate and have gotten the help that I needed, and the individual was willing to work with us. So I was always able to find a way.
Now, as far as the teaching of your seminary is concerned, what's the position on this issue for priests?
In terms of the confessional, I haven't dealt with them in that regard. That's up to our priests. But I do talk with them about these issues, but not in terms of the confessional per se.
Father Thompson?
The case you're proposing, I would think, would technically not come under the seal of confession. I would just wonder, though, if I were to reveal that without the little child's consent, whether I would damage her understanding of the confidentiality of confession. I would hope that what others have suggested would work. My first reaction was, look, let's go and talk to someone about this together. If she's happy to come with me, and that's really she giving consent. Or even if she said, no, will you let me tell someone? But I think she may need, our little child may need perhaps to be convinced that no one will hurt her. I just hope I never find myself in that situation.
The issue, I think, behind the question is what's being taught in the seminary. What guidance are you giving to those in formation who may well be faced with exactly that situation?
Right. I can't say for sure what's being taught in my seminary on that. It's an area of moral theology, and I'd have to ask the lecturer in moral theology what he's teaching.
Do you know what's being taught in your seminary?
Sorry, yeah.
Yes.
If I could just come back to the main question, please. As far as I understand it, the secret of the seal of confession is kind of dissolved if the person gives you permission to act on their behalf. So I kind of maybe was a little bit misunderstood.
That much is plain, but it would not be unexpected. But the child, in disclosing to the priest, believes the child's been at fault, and maybe in real fear of the abuser, and may say, no, I don't want you to tell anyone.
The child.
Whereas you know that it might be an 8-year-old, might be whatever, is actually presently in danger. The question is, what are you able to do?
Yes, I'm aware that one of the big things about child abuse is the child themselves feel guilty.
Yeah.
Being able to try and convince the child that that's not the case. And I think it may need a lot of patience and time.
But you have a child who's telling you they are presently being abused.
I would do my uttermost to let me help them.
But again, Father, do you know what's being taught in your
that area? Moral theology, it's outsourced to the two other colleges. I'm not quite sure.
So the answer is you don't know what's being
know.
taught on that issue. Do you think you should know?
I think I should.
And you, Father?
Yes, I mean, I have an obligation to know what is being taught if it significantly affects a question like this. It's a question, I must admit, that's never come up with me. I've never had to face.
It certainly hasn't been uncommon in private sessions for people to tell us that as children they actually confessed, or in confession told the priest that they'd been abused. The other issue that came up in evidence last week as well was regarding a confession by a perpetrator about abuse of a child, and how that is handled in confession. How is that issue taught in the seminaries or in formation?
Once again, this would come into moral theology. My reaction would be I could not grant absolution unless the perpetrator agreed to go to authorities and reveal the situation, hand himself in. One cannot grant absolution if the wish to make full reparation and to avoid a similar problem in the future is not there.
If they don't follow through with the instruction to report and you can't grant absolution, does that allow you to break the seal of confession and report?
No.
Did anyone else want to make a comment?
I apologise, I couldn't hear.
It was about the issue of a perpetrator in confession, confessing to abusing a child,
Yes.
and the response by the priest in that scenario. And the second question related to if the priest instructs the person that they have to report as part of their, receiving absolution, and they don't do that, does that give the priest an out in terms of breaking the seal of confession?
I checked this one out with the canon lawyer. He says that if the person, the perpetrator, is sincerely sorry and is intending never to do anything like that again, you cannot withhold the absolution. And that's the canon lawyer's answer to me on that one. So, because the absolution is a pronouncement of God's forgiveness, and God's forgiveness is always there. So you can't make it dependent on him doing something. One can encourage him to go and hand himself in. I certainly would, because what you're trying to do is, if somebody's already doing something like that, that there is a chance of him doing it again, even if he doesn't intend to or doesn't want to, because we have to protect future victims.
What happens if absolution is given and then within a few weeks the same priest turns up to confession again to confess the same sort of behaviour? What happens then?
We need to deal with them according to the rules and regulations of confession, because we understand it as God's court, and we're only acting on God's behalf.
So you grant absolution again?
If the person is sorry and has a firm purpose of amendment, yes.
Do you reach the point where you wouldn't accept that they were sorry and had a real purpose?
If you had a doubt that they were sorry, then you could withhold absolution.
Anyone else to comment on that?
I don't know what the answer is to the question because I think it's I can understand it from both sides. However, I think one of the problems that we're facing, and this has come up a number of times in the hearings within, and one notable one in a conversation between Your Honour and Bishop Bede Heather, I don't think that the church, seminarians, priests, not globally, but I suspect to a significant degree, understand how society works and the obligations that we have as a common community within society. And because I don't think we understand that fully, and we don't understand a whole lot of aspects of civil society, we haven't gone into the conversation that you've been trying to lead people along. We haven't had that robust debate about how that works. And I think that's a failing on the part of the church, and it will continue to be a failing on the part of the church for as long as the church does not fully understand how civil society works. And the fact that the church is within civil society, and we have an obligation to work within the framework of civil society, so that our laws, the church's canons, have to interact with civil society, and there must be that battle that goes on in such a way that we try and resolve some of those issues. In respect of the first case example that you provided, Justice, for me, it's a no-brainer. I think it's not my role in the first instance, if I was in that situation of the girl saying to me, separate to a confession of sin, if I was in that situation, it would be very clear to me around my reporting obligations. And I don't think if it's a child, it's about negotiating with the child. I think it's about protection first. I think it's about safety first. I think it's about making sure that nothing happens that does harm to this person as far as we are able. And I don't think we've got that. I don't think we fully understand the significance of that. I don't think we understand the psychology that underpins our modern understanding of child sexual abuse. And as a result, we fluff around the edges and we try and negotiate, and it's really clear in every other jurisdiction except the church. If somebody reports something to you, you have an obligation to report that. And the reporting isn't about trying to work out whether the person will understand or not understand. Let's work with that further down the path. Let's make sure the person is not in harm's way. That's our life above all things.
Dr. Leary, one of the reasons child sexual abuse has occasionally been described as a crime against humanity is because of the great harm it causes, including early death and suicide. This Commission has heard in evidence child sexual abuse as being described as the murder of souls.
It's certainly the murder of innocence.
What you have said earlier is that a lack of understanding and a lack of compassion, either or both, enables priests to hear confessions and allow abuse to carry on, which will result in the murder of souls and terrible harm to those individuals concerned. Now, some of the witnesses to this commission, clerics, have said they believe the greater good should prevail. In other words, exactly what you said, the protection of the child overcomes everything else. Others have said the seal of the confessional matters more than the murder of a soul. They didn't use that exact language, but that's the impact. What is your view, now that you know what it does to a child? If a perpetrator came and told you in confession, would you really allow that perpetrator to continue?
Let me be very clear. So I'm not a priest and have no desire to be a priest.
Put yourself in the shoes.
Oh, yeah, I can easily do that. For me, again, because I've got a lengthy history of working in social sciences and as a counsellor, the battles that I have had over that occurred 30 years ago. It's very clear to me now that if there is a common good argument here, that if I was a priest and I was in the confessional and I understood very clearly the distinction that was made and obviously has been made here in evidence, then it would be the first thing, regardless of whether the person gave me permission to report or not, I would definitely report. It's not my role to assess safety issues. It's my role to presume that if the person is telling me that sexual abuse has occurred, then safety is automatically an issue. It's not up to me to assess that. My obligation, and this is clearly formulated within civil society, my obligation is to report and to allow other people to do their job, whether it's the police or social services or sexual abuse counsellors or whoever, that I should not place myself as an authority in that situation over the common wisdom that is evident, very evident in society today around this issue. And there is a very strong common, I think, a common good argument that given Justice McClellan's outlining of the situation, it's very clear.
Father Kelly, can I ask you a quite specific question about something you've said in your statement? You talk about the involvement of I think it's the Kairos program in formation. That's a coordinated effort by Catholic Religious Australia to provide education to different orders, is that right?
That's correct.
And you've said in that context that over the past 4 years there's been a greater emphasis and time given within the Kairos program to human development, psychosexual development, health and well-being, professional standards and child protection. Can you explain what prompted that development over the last 4 years?
We, as formators, we thought that in the context of the sexual abuse, we felt that we needed to have more input on this and more understanding, both from the psychosexual point of view, but also from the professional standards point of view, from what it means to live in community, celibate community, that kind of thing, community life skills. And even health, we built in health into that. So that was the context in which it developed.
So that...
And we draw on the best professionals that we can get.
That comes to an issue that you might have heard raised yesterday. I don't know if you had the opportunity to follow the evidence, but one of the commissioners asked yesterday, is there a consciousness on the part of those who are involved in designing formation syllabuses, curricula, etc.? Is there a consciousness that the formation they're designing has to respond to perceived deficiencies in the past that may have contributed to the child sexual abuse problem? Now,
well, I think this was a good example of that.
Is there any reason, was there any particular event 4 years ago or so that prompted that consideration?
No, just the continual reportage of it and the seeming growth, of revelation about it. So we thought that we needed to try and this program, bringing people together that this would be a good way, a good beginning anyway, to try and address it.
Sister Allen, can I ask you whether in your seminary, firstly, are you involved at all in the design of the formation program within the seminary?
The part that I take, yes.
Right. As part of that, have there been conversations along the same lines of how do we redesign the formation program to address deficiencies that might be in part related to the child sexual abuse problem?
Well, when I came in, I established this program that we have now, and it's in accord with some of the seminaries that we know of in the United States. And so I spent a great deal of time talking about child sexual abuse in this program and on what happens to a child and to an adolescent who is sexually abused, what the experience is as far as teaching psychologically, emotionally, physically, what the effects are of child sexual abuse to the extent that we can. And then I also talk a lot about the characteristics of pedophiles and ephebophiles. So we spend a great deal of time on that.
Did you hear the evidence yesterday of Dr. Geraldine Robinson?
Yes, part of it.
You may or may not have heard this part, but Dr. Robinson was expressing the view that part of a healthy formation environment for psychosexual development and understanding the sexual identity of seminarians requires openness about sexual issues.
Yes.
And in that context, she expressed a particular concern that because of the Church's teaching on homosexuality and the disqualification of people who are seen as having a deep-seated tendency to homosexuality, that was a significant impediment to openness within the seminary. Did you hear her talking about that?
I did.
Now, that was a topic we touched on earlier today. Do you have a concern that because of the message which has effectively been conveyed to seminarians that if they reveal a deep-seated tendency to homosexuality, they're disqualified from ordination and from continuing in the seminary, that's going to impede them from open communication?
No, I do not. That's not been my experience in the seminary. As a matter of fact, the seminarians come to me freely, and we talk about very detailed aspects of their sexuality. And we have a very good, trusting relationship.
Sister Ellen, on a related matter regarding that, if they meant to adopt a celibacy as a way of life, what difference does their sexual orientation make, if any?
Again, it would take a lot to explain it entirely because...
We've got some time.
All right. What it means is that certainly what we focus on is...
Do they see it as a risk? Is that one of the issues?
In terms of what? Child sexual abuse?
Anything. Breaking the vows?
No.
Boundary
No,
violation?
that's not the issue. That is not the issue. So what we focus on is chaste celibacy. So it's the chastity that is the context for the celibacy.
So what difference does that make then in regard to their orientation?
In regard to sexual orientation, I have to say that we've only once did we have a situation where there was a situation where someone had a deep-seated sexual, homosexual direction in their own lives, and they refused to be formed. And for us, those two together made it impossible for that individual. It was in the very beginning phases. They were for about 2 or 3 weeks, and that was it. And so during that phase of their beginning formation, it became evident that we could not continue to have them in the seminary because they were not open to formation. And I'm not talking about just sexual formation. They were not being respectful or accepting of what the staff was saying to them, and not only myself. Yeah, but it's so those two things went together, and otherwise I've never had that situation where I've had someone want to be included in the seminary, want to be accepted into the seminary, who had deep-seated sexual issues related to homosexuality. So in terms of the question is, if they live celibately and if they are chaste, that's what we work toward. But we have to be able to work with someone.
But Sister, you're being asked, why does it matter whether the orientation is heterosexual or homosexual if that's the sort of person that you want? Someone who will live a celibate, chaste life.
The issue is not whether they're homosexual or heterosexual. The issue is whether it's a deep-seated issue of this is what I am, this is who I am, and I want to belong to the gay community, etc., etc. All right, that's the issue. And it's a lack of willingness to be formed, to be in one heart and one mind with the church. That's the issue. It's very different from the way, I'm not sure that I can explain it to you clearly, but...
No, I'm not sure it's helpful because there will be presumably heterosexual people who might have a deep-seated heterosexuality that will manifest itself in various ways that heterosexuals might. Commissioner Milroy is asking you, given your knowledge and understanding, why does the Church see a difference?
I mean, I can't speak for the Church per se, but I can say that that is the issue of having to do with the male identity and the ability to be in line with the... I started talking about the natural law before, and the natural law, according to Catholic teaching, is that the male, in terms of his male sexuality, is masculine. So it's a male sexuality, and sorry. All right, so that has to be the genetic code of the male is masculine, is male, and so he's masculine male, and the woman, the female, is feminine. All right, and so there is a clear distinction between the two. All right, and it's based in natural law. So that's the basis of this teaching.
Does the same issue apply to women entering female religious orders?
Is what the same issue, you mean?
Same-sex attraction. Are they excluded from female religious orders?
I do not know that. I do not know that.
Thank you. Can I turn to the question of foreign candidates? I asked you each earlier, or some of you at least, the extent to which you had people born overseas in your seminary training, in your seminaries for training, rather. And the Commission would be interested to hear from you on any issues you've encountered in that regard. Can I start with you, Father Thompson? There's been a lot of discussion throughout these hearings about the church culture and cultural change over time, which one might think could present issues if people come from other cultures to receive formation training here. What's been your experience with foreign candidates in your seminary?
Yes. The church in some of these countries, there's evidence of clericalism. If I can single one out, and it's not the only one, because I have been to Nigeria twice. And it's very much based on the Irish model, as we are, but perhaps it's still closer to Ireland. And it's very much the people putting their priest on a pedestal that leads to this attitude. we have to point this out to the Nigerian seminarians and point out that here in Australia it's quite different. That we have to wash our own clothes, we have to cook our meals and so forth. They learn quick enough. I haven't... they soon catch on. And I would expect, perhaps to a lesser extent, but to some extent in other, especially sort of Catholic, very strongly Catholic communities, the Philippines, parts of India, that is a challenge that we have to meet, that they do come with this idea of the special privilege of the priest that they find in their home culture. But to be fair to them, they seem to react very positively to the instruction and to the change of outlook that they see here, and there's really been, I'm not aware of any problems with those who have reached ordination along this area.
Thank you. Father Hogan, can I ask what your experience
Yeah,
has been?
thanks. In my experience, I haven't come across problems with clericalism. If there's any issues at all, they're cultural ones, which you're going to find between different cultures, and there's been nothing that's been insurmountable. The more exposure modern-day Australia has to all sorts of cultures, the more we're learning and have certain expectations that they're going to be different, and we're able to meet them quite successfully.
In regard to that clash of cultures, perhaps, is there any difference in the views regarding children? Or rights of children?
I've certainly not come across it. What I've come across is a deep love and respect for children.
Sister Allen, can I ask you whether you've got any insights on that experience from your seminary?
We don't have any seminarians from foreign countries who are expecting to have a privileged place, as far as I'm aware. As a matter of fact, we have a number coming in from Vietnam, and they're very grateful to serve. And so it is my hope that as they continue through the formation, that will continue to be supported within them.
Dr. Leary, have you had any dealings with foreign candidates that you could enlighten?
Yes, in a number of my classes, I often have students from other countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, various African countries. I think the issues that I come across are certainly around culture and cultural understandings. By way of example, during a course I ran last year, I played a movie halfway through the course which dealt with issues of loss and grief. It happened to be a gay couple, one of whom had died, but the real conflict was between, or the real difficulty was between the surviving partner and the victim's mother, and there was a language barrier and what have you. And one of the students went back to his formator and said, I think I should have been warned about that movie before I saw it. And that presented as an interesting challenge to talk with him about how, firstly, we live in a very multicultural society, or there's lots of different people and there's lots of different circumstances, and we are called to serve, but also to try and get to the bottom of why that was an issue for him. And so there are some aspects of Western culture that are very foreign to some seminarians from overseas that only, I believe, come to the fore once they're in a situation where they're confronted with that particular element or that particular factor. So the risk is that in the normal course of every day, nothing appears to be problematic. But it's when you come face to face with difference, otherness, something that is out of the ordinary, something that is beyond your experience or beyond what your church might come across back in your land of origin, where the issue becomes problematic. And again, I would be saying loud and clear that intellectual input is one thing. Very carefully supervised longitudinal practice is another thing altogether. And that's where I believe the real formation happens, on the ground where the rubber hits the road. And that's why I would argue very strongly for a different frame of reference in terms of formation.
I think we're going to get the benefits of your views on that topic tomorrow, so we might develop that further.
Let's not go any further. Steal my thunder.
Father Kelly, have you got any views on the cultural issue that I've raised regarding foreign candidates?
We have sometimes a Jesuit will come over in order to act as a chaplain to migrant community, but we don't normally bring candidates over. Sometimes a Jesuits from overseas will come for study, so they might come and do some theology or spirituality in Australia, and they will stay. But they won't engage in public ministry unless they've gone through all the appropriate protocols. Currently, in the novitiate, we have a man from Tonga who's been a priest for 16 years and has joined the Jesuits. But because there's no Jesuit presence in Tonga, this is the closest. So this is where we've got him now, and that's interesting because I think in our parish there's a huge Tongan community. So in a way, he's teaching us about them, and we're teaching him about us. So that seems to be what's happening through the formation, and he will do the full formation, like the full initial formation of novitiate.
Thank you, Father. I have no further questions.
I had some questions. Sorry, Ms. Needham, could I perhaps ask my questions because something might arise from them? Perhaps if I could ask Father Kelly, but please invite anyone else to join in. Just for my own understanding, firstly, though, can it be that a priest is fully trained and working as a priest overseas and comes here to Australia and can commence work as a priest here in a parish immediately? Or does that priest have to go through some induction process here in terms of local culture? Do you know the answer to that, Father Kelly?
I can't answer it because we don't do it. But
you don't do it, but does anyone do it? Could I ask everyone on the panel?
Yeah.
Certainly, as a Franciscan, if a priest came from overseas, and we've got one Vietnamese here at the moment, they have to go through an induction program. That doesn't always work, and one of our priests returned to his country of origin because it clearly didn't work for him.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment on that? Don't know.
My understanding is that most dioceses do require this. I mean, they may be though all, but I know lots of dioceses that do require an induction program.
Could I ask Father Kelly, but others please feel free to comment. And the first part of three parts that I wanted to ask about goes back to what Commissioner Miller was talking about. Father Kelly, do you know how many seminaries or places of training there are in Australia?
No.
Does anyone, sorry?
No, I don't.
Does anyone know how many there are in Australia? How many seminaries or places of formation training?
I can answer for diocesan seminaries. I think there's 7. But then you've got a lot of religious institutes who have their own formation houses, and I wouldn't know how many of those there are.
Okay, so does it flow obviously from that, and I mean, it would seem as though all of you have vast, extensive experience in this field of formation and training, but that throughout Australia, all of you who are in charge of these places of formation and training and seminaries, you don't get together annually and have a conference and share information?
Oh, yes.
You do?
Yes, every year.
What, every year?
Mm.
Okay. Then Commissioner Milroy's question about developing a shared curriculum that identifies best practice, do you do that together?
At times, yes. Different areas have come up where we have looked at best practice. Through illness, I've had to be absent from the last couple, so I'm not quite sure what's gone on. But my memory is that very often, as a result of those conferences, we have come away with a better understanding of issues and being able to implement them in our own seminaries.
Okay, is there anything documented in that regard as what would be a best practice basic manual that you can expand on locally if you wish to?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay, thank you. The second one sort of flows from that, really. Again, could I direct the question to Father Kelly? But in terms of human resource management, organisationally, are you provided with national statistics that talk about, for example, recruitment and retention and the numbers of priests that are needed in Australia and the retention rates and the sources? It would seem to me, for example, that you have 3 sources for priests. One is overseas trained priests who travel to Australia and become priests here. The second would be people from Australia who are trained locally. And the third would be people from overseas who are trained locally. Tell me if you disagree with that. You don't seem to. So are you provided with any national statistics so you have a picture of, from a human resource management perspective, of where the Catholic Church is generally in terms of meeting the need for priests?
No, I'm not. But, yeah.
The sense of what we've been told here is that priests generally are ageing and that there is a lack of priests across the country. Is that a fair comment?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And the third one, and again, Father Kelly, and it's only because you made this observation, but you mentioned 2 terms, and it was in the context, I guess, of someone going out and learning the ropes, so to speak, and you mentioned the term good priests, and then, as I understood it, you described good priests as priests who are pastorally effective. And I just wondered if you or any of the panel are aware if there's any performance indicators that the Church has ever developed in terms of what defines a good priest who is pastorally effective.
I think there are some, but I can't think of where I've seen some of those indicators.
Well, the sort of thing, could I suggest 3? One might be, I don't know myself, but just 3 that would jump out to me would be the number of people attending church, the financial income for the parish, and the number or absence of complaints about the parish priest. There are 3 possibilities. Would you agree that they could be performance indicators?
They could be. It shows him as a good administrator. But I think other things like how he preaches the word, how he conducts sacramental ministry, what's his pastoral style, and what's that like? So that there are, I think, things that are there that you'd be looking at and saying, yeah.
But again, it doesn't sound as though that's been documented. Is it an internal thing? Is it that people know who the good priests are and know who you might send someone to?
Will your laity tell you who the good priests are? Really? You know that by...
Well, except that some of the case studies we've done rather suggest it doesn't work very well sometimes.
Yeah, well...
I can just say that in the seminary, we have a number of different qualities that are looked at and graded, so to speak, by the staff, the seminary staff. It's not national, obviously, but it's just within our seminary where we take a look at the qualities that would be considered in fostering a good priesthood, in terms of the qualities that Father was just speaking about.
Well, some of them, yes, yes. I mean, it just seemed to me that no one would, I think, would argue that you'd want to produce good priests who are pastorally effective, together with them going the distance and not leaving the priesthood at an early time, together with them themselves, in terms of their own personal well-being, being in a very good place. And it just seemed to me that all of those things are capable of performance indicators, and they clearly link back to recruitment and training. And
yes, they do.
My sense of it, without wanting to sound critical, is that that doesn't seem to exist in some sort of documented, structured, clear way. Is that an unfair comment?
No, I don't think it's an unfair comment, but and I don't know whether this was, I got this information from a priest in Sale, where the Sale diocese, where I've been doing some work, or from one of the witnesses who's coming up tomorrow, and I don't want to put him in the middle of it, but it may well be a relevant question for tomorrow with Father Greg Burke, if I remember that he's on the panel, because he's dealing with the clergy life and ministry, and certainly I know that there's a template for evaluation that I've seen that has been being rolled out. But I think it's a lack in our, both in our formation but also in our ongoing professional development. In every other discipline there would be instruments that are easily obtainable, that are used across the board, social work, psychology, medicine, where it's easy to work out to some degree the effectiveness of the person in their role. Those instruments can be fairly blunt instruments, but they give you some indicator of, and it's not just about management, but I would argue very strongly, and this is a matter for tomorrow, I would argue very strongly that there's a whole lot of things that need to be in place that allow us to be able to say as individuals, I believe I'm acting effectively, partly because I've got these structures and strategies in place. And there is a tendency, I think, in the formation at the moment to see those sort of structures and strategies as being relating to initial formation. And I would argue very strongly that it's a part of life. It's a cradle to grave. The moment you come in, you start the processes of individual supervision, professional development, doing a certain number of hours of ongoing professional training every year, etc. There's a list of them. And that goes on not just in the seminary, but right throughout your time as a priest or a brother or a sister, or as a pastoral minister.
In lay terms, it comes down to how the church manages.
Yes, and the structures that it's willing to commit itself to give us the greatest potential for doing good and avoiding evil.
Father Stephen Rossetti wrote an article in 2012, and based on two studies that he did in 2002, I believe in 2007, and it's based on the happiness of the priest. And it took a look at all of the aspects that together assist priests in being happy in their ministry, and including their own, living their own interior life, their relationship with God, their establishing their own friendships and having solid friendships with priests, with lay people, their capacity, the way they experience their own relationships with others. And So that might be a good study to take a look at also, because he does address the issue of effectiveness, but through the priests, and particularly the younger priests, were coming up and being much happier than the older priests who had gone through the old formation system in the old seminaries. So it's an important study that he did.
Were any of the contents of that study again, Sister, formally adopted into performance indicators?
I would have to ask in the American Church whether that is the case or not.
Okay, thank you. Nothing further.
I think tomorrow some of that will come up, but one of the issues, just if I can take it up, Sister, is the church life surveys that have been taking place in Australia for many years. To what extent the learnings from those surveys are in fact informing the formation of priests. That is our formation of priests truly reflective of what the lay faithful expect of priests? Or is that done in isolation, that priests and bishops determine what priests should be, but the voice of the laity in determining that is absent? The information is there, but my question is really, is there any evidence that that information, which is regularly collected, is in fact informing the way in which priests and others are in fact formed?
I would say in part, but I can't talk about details in that regard.
Well, tomorrow we might have a chat about that with others.
It's needed.
Thank you, Anna. I only have a couple of questions for Sister Lydia. Sister, in your evidence before lunch, you were asked some questions about the way in which the Vatican provided instructions for, in effect, requiring screening and training of applicants consistent with the principles relating to prevention of child sexual abuse and safety of children.
Yes.
And in particular, Commissioner Murray asked you, does the Vatican lay a request on you to pay specific attention to whether a candidate has a sexual interest in children? Do you remember that question?
Yes,
and the questions around
yes,
it?
I do.
Now, I'd like to take you to a number of documents which appear in the tender bundle. And the first is a document at tab 27. And there's no need necessarily to go to them, because I'm just going to ask them whether, firstly, you're aware of them, and secondly, whether each of these documents is consistent with your answer to Commissioner Murray that there were documents which did so require.
Yes.
Okay, the first one is tab 27, and that is the letter to the bishops, clergy and faithful, referred to as Pastores Dabo Vobis.
Yes.
You're aware of that document?
Yes, we use it a great deal.
And what does that document say, in brief, in relation to the requirement for what has been referred to as human formation?
Well, the dignity of all human beings, including men, women and children, needs to be respected.
Now, acting upon that message from the Holy Father, at tab 30 of the bundle, there is a document from the Australian Catholic Bishops Committee, the ACBC, known as the Program for Priestly Formation Australia. Mm-hmm. And again, are you aware of this, and does it reflect your practice within the seminary?
Yes, it does.
And that was a document, while produced by the ACBC, which was in 2007, I think, was adopted or given effect to by the Vatican.
Yes.
Now, tab 31 of the bundle is a document called the Gift of Priestly Vocation.
Yes.
And that is quite a long document, but perhaps you could be shown, I'm sorry, I've just lost the reference to the page, paragraph 202. And that, going down, scrolling down. Page 0083 I see it's up. The Commission staff are ahead of me, Commissioners, and you see there,
Yes.
Sister, some information on the requirement information as to assessment of persons coming into seminaries. Have you got a comment on how that document governs your practice?
It's a relatively new document, but it really just reinforces what we've already been practicing and teaching.
Now, you mentioned in your evidence that you have had correspondence or communication with the Pontifical Commission for the Protection
Yes.
of Minors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, behind tab 44 of the bundle is a document entitled The Statute of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors.
Yes, that charter. Yes.
Can you explain the role of that document or where that document is going?
Where it's going?
Yes.
What do you mean? What it's discussing?
What does it do?
Well, it's in regard to the protection of children. In regard to any kind of abuse towards children.
And what is the role of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors in relation to seminary practice?
Well, we follow their teaching, of course. And they are, as I said before, they are really wanting to bring out a document that's much longer on the protection of children and helping children who have been sexually abused.
And perhaps I could take you now to tab 46 of that document. And this is the guidelines which have been proposed, a template for guidelines proposed by the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Now, if you scroll through to page 3 of that document, 0003. Do you have that document in front of you, Sister?
Yes.
You'll see that page 3.
Working groups.
Yes, a little further down. Sorry, I'm looking at the page number at the top right-hand corner.
Yes.
Yes. You'll see that there is a statement in relation to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's on the screen. We might be looking at different documents.
Yes.
Yes. Is that something that the seminary practice takes into regard?
Yes.
And moving forward through that document, the next part I would like to take you to is page 0005, paragraph 4 in that document at the bottom of the page. And that paragraph states that these guidelines seek to put in place effectively rules for each territory of the church. What would be the territory of the church, the relevant territory of the church that we'd be referring to?
I think this is a different place.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I say no. I'm sorry. Yes, territory. In the territory where you exist, where you are.
So would that be Australia?
That would be Australia. Yes.
And scrolling down to page 6, paragraph 5 refers to safe recruitment. Do you see that? And again, that picks up a 2011 letter through the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, looking at proper vetting of all persons seeking to work within the church.
Yes.
Are these guidelines, draft as they are, something that would be welcomed by certainly your seminary?
Well, they're actually, yes, absolutely. They are in line with what we teach.
And when you gave your answer about there being documents which were consistent with child protection coming from the Vatican, were these the kind of documents that you were referring to?
Yes.
Nothing further.
Thank you, Ms. Needham. That was actually very helpful. I'm obliged to you. The one thing I'd raise for future discussion, but not today, is your highlighting of the best interests of the child in the International Convention. And of course, something like the seal of the Confessional can be in direct conflict with that principle. And it is something I'd raise later. But thank you very much. It was helpful.
It is unfortunate, Your Honour, that we weren't able to have the session on with the representative from the Pontifical Commission, which was planned but unable to proceed, I think, last Friday.
Ms Needham, can I just ask, the status of that document is draft?
It is draft.
Has the Church indicated a timetable for its completion?
I do not know the answer to that, Commissioner. I can find out, but it is part of the work. There is a meeting of the Pontifical Commission, I think, in March.
Thank you.
Yes, well, thank all of you for your time and contribution to the Commission. 4 of you can be excused, but Doctor, you have to come back tomorrow, I think.
I do.
We'll see you then, but otherwise, thank you again, and we'll adjourn until 10 o'clock in the morning.
All rise.